and keep these things in mind, and make sure that you take the time to post correctly, to pay the right wages, to keep the file up, to maintain it properly. You should be in good shape, and you should have no liability. I'd like to just move on to I-9s for a moment. I-9s are something that everybody gets frustrated with. The I-9 document, I'm sure everyone on the call is aware, but just in case there's someone who isn't, the I-9 is that form that every new employee on their first day of employment in the United States has to fill out. Everyone fills this out, regardless of whether they're a U.S. citizen, a permanent resident, or if they have any other status in the United States. The form has to be completed on the first day and finished by the third day of employment. It's really important to ensure that there's actually an I-9 on file at a company for everybody who has been employed by the company since the law went into effect, which was in November of 1986. And you have to make sure that you keep the I-9s for the requisite period of time required by law for record-keeping purposes. So the rule of thumb is that you have to have an I-9 for everybody for at least 3 years or 1 year past their last date of employment, whichever is later. So if you end up having an employee who only works for 6 months or a year, you still have to keep their I-9 for 3 years. And if you have someone who's employed by you for 4 years, you have to keep the I-9 for 5 years. When you no longer have to keep an I-9, it's highly recommended that you eliminate it from your record, either by taking it out from the binder it might be in or shredding it, etc. Because there's really no reason to keep a document beyond the legally required period of time. My advice for best practices for keeping I-9s is the following: to separate them into 3 separate groups. One, you're going to have the I-9s that, when filled out initially, are complete, and there will never be a need to review the I-9 again. That's because, for example, the person who filled it out may have been a U.S. citizen or a lawful permanent resident, presented a document which never has to be revisited. Those you would keep in one place. Next, you want to remember that you can get rid of the I-9s that you no longer have to keep by keeping separate or removing from one binder and placing them in another binder all the I-9s of anybody who leaves the company or is terminated. So you would take out from the first binder the I-9 of, for example, employee A who's been terminated, move it into the terminated binder, and then someone would be monitoring that, should be monitoring it all year long to check and make sure when a year has passed from the date of termination or the date of last day of employment, so that you can remove the I-9 from your records permanently. And then most companies that employ people in any kind of visa status, it's best for them to keep an I-9 binder just for those I-9s that need to be re-verified. Anybody who presents a document in their I-9 that shows that they have a work authorization that is going to end at a certain date in the future must have the I-9 re-verified on or before their date of employment, their date of work authorization is. Because the I-9 serves 2 purposes. It's supposed to demonstrate that the person you're hiring is who they say they are and is authorized to work in the United States. So anybody who presents a work authorization, whether it's in the form of any type of temporary work visa, it will have an end date on it. And it's really important to do a tickler system and make sure that you know to check back in with the employee prior to the date when their work authorization ends to update the I-9. It's legally required to update it. So because there's usually a discrete number of people on visas in the company, it's really a good idea to keep their I-9s in a separate place so it's easier to check and re-verify and update them.
Susan, we have a question regarding the electronic storage of I-9s. Is that an option here?
Yes. It's possible to store I-9s electronically. And that law was changed a few years ago to allow for electronic storage. But my caution with that would be that you have to make sure that their privacy concerns addressed with that. It's really important to make sure that they're encrypted, because I-9s have very sensitive information on them, including the employee's social security number. And so it's just very, very important that if you use an electronic storage system, that you make sure that you have absolutely vetted the system to ensure that it's encrypted and that it's a secure system. I recommend that companies do at least a yearly I-9 audit. And along with that, it's really important to minimize the number of people in a company who are responsible for I-9s. I-9s tend to be an area that people don't pay that much attention to, and people who often end up with the responsibility for filling out I-9s aren't not properly trained in the complexities and the nuances of all the different documents that can be presented for an I-9. And I see a lot of mistakes in I-9s, and one way to avoid that is to just reduce the number of people who do the I-9s in any given company, and make sure that whoever is doing it gets good training at least once a year, because the I-9 rules are often changing, and I-9 form changes regularly. It's really good to make sure that who is ever responsible is getting good advice and keeping up with best practices.
Susan, we have two more questions regarding the I-9. One goes back to electronic storage, and one of our attendees asks, do you have to delete the data as you would if you were storing it in a file or in the binders as you've described? Do you have to go back into your electronic storage and delete I-9s?
No, you don't need to. You don't need to, but you should if you could. And there's no reason to keep it past the legally required time. The law doesn't require you to destroy I-9s. You just don't have to keep them. So it's a good practice to eliminate the data that you don't need. But there's nothing illegal about keeping I-9s longer than you need to.
And the next question is actually goes to what you were just discussing, and that is, what are the best ways for a company to understand if they are handling their I-9s properly? Is there some sort of training class, or do you recommend that they work with a firm such as your own? What's the best way for them to become educated on the I-9 process?
Yes, it's a very good question, and it's important to get help from an expert at least at the outset. So if there's any question about whether you may or may not be doing the I-9s properly, I do recommend a training and some kind of audit. We conduct them at our firm. We do trainings by webinar like this, which can be participated in by various HR professionals in a company, even if they're in different locations. And there are plenty of other firms out there who also do I-9 trainings and audits. And I think I'd be more than happy to talk offline with whoever asked the question about it after this, and I can either offer advice to you or recommend someone else that you might be able to talk to. But if you're not sure, you definitely would benefit from some kind of expert advice. Typically, it's going to be an immigration attorney, although there are also companies out there that do I-9. That do I-9 audits and I-9 counseling. There are some HR services companies that do it. Although I have to say that I have seen the advice that some of the companies give, and it's not always 100% accurate. So you just need to make sure that you get a good company that you're working with.
And we have yet another question regarding I-9s. The question is, can you store and manage I-9s centrally? For a company with a highly decentralized workforce, such as a restaurant group with 100 or more locations, that does sound very complicated.
Yes, you may centralize I-9s in one location. But the difficult thing about a highly decentralized organization and the thing that tends to result in noncompliance with a lot of companies of that nature is that the I-9 rules require whoever is filling out the I-9 on behalf of the company to see the original documents of the person who's being hired. And you can't send photocopies to your headquarters office and ask an HR person in headquarters to fill out the I-9. So you actually have to deputize someone in the field to properly complete the I-9 and then send the I-9 for maintenance to the headquarters office. And I actually spend a lot of my time advising decentralized companies with field operations about how to do I-9s. Sometimes you've got somebody working out of an office, maybe out of a home office, in a place that's very remote from where the rest of the offices of the company are working, and you actually have to deputize an agent to serve as your I-9 agent so that the person can sit down with someone and show them their documents. And again, it's really important to make sure that the person, again, A, is who they say they are, and B, that they're authorized to work, that this process gets done properly. So yes, you can centralize it, but be very careful to make sure that whoever is actually completing the I-9 knows what they're doing and is actually face-to-face with the individual. Any more questions on that? Okay.
No, it looks like we have completed our I-9 questions.
Okay. The I-9s are, you know, a can of worms. And I could talk about I-9s for hours, but that could be the subject of another webinar. Just another caveat on the I-9s before we move on to some other topics and finish up. A word to the wise about making sure that you, as an employer, don't ever hire someone as an independent contractor knowing that they're on a visa status. That's not considered legal. Anybody on a work visa in the United States may not be an independent contractor, with one very, very rare exception. Almost every type of visa requires there to be an employer-employee relationship. And so knowing that, if you can't I-9 someone because you see that they don't have a proper work visa status and they're not allowed to work for your company, you can't hire them, doesn't mean that you can turn around and hire them as an independent contractor, which doesn't, of course, require an I-9. The dependent contractors on 1099s don't get I-9'd. But it's a violation of the law to try to do that, you know, as a way around not hiring somebody who needs a visa that you can't get for them. The other thing that's really important about I-9s in general is just to make sure that you work very hard not to engage in any kind of discrimination around the I-9 process or even the appearance of it. It's important not to ask for particular documents when people are completing the I-9. The I-9 has on the back of it a list of all the different documents someone can show you when you complete the I-9. And it's not proper to ask for anything in particular. It's very common, for example, for people to give an employer a driver's license and a Social Security card, but it wouldn't be proper for the employer to say, here's an I-9, you can give me your license and your Social Security card and then I'll fill it out. So it's really important not to suggest which documents the person shows you. At the same time, while it's really important not to engage in any kind of discrimination, it's also important not to close your eyes to irregularities in documents. If there's something that somebody gives you on the I-9 document that looks very, very suspicious, so for example, the picture, the photograph in the document might be at an angle, might be askew, might clearly look like a forged or tampered with document, then you do have an obligation to follow up about it. But if it looks okay to you and to an ordinary person, nothing would stand out,